So as we focus on leading through conflict and change, I think it's important for us to recognize the why behind leading any organization or congregation through a process of change that oftentimes might also expose some differences that are inevitable and might lead to conflict. I want to somehow deactivate some of the reactivity that we often have to the word conflict and help us understand that it is really a process of dealing with inevitable differences that arise in human communities, and that there are ways, there are behaviors, there are practices in managing differences that allow us to acknowledge the differences, to utilize the differences, to learn through them, and move through them to a different place. So as a beginning, I want to just say that I want to set this context for change and conflict in a broader arena than we usually do. I want to talk about some disciplines in congregational and organizational conversation as we move through change. As I look through some of your papers, I realized that it's really important for us to find a language and a process that also integrates with some of our spiritual disciplines as well. So I want to incorporate that into this presentation. I want to recognize, even if I just do it here in this moment, that one of those leadership practices was challenging the process. And challenging the process in an organization or a congregation is sometimes hard to do unless we have some perspectives and some practices for doing that in a grounded way that can help an organization move to its next developmental level or shift that it might need to make. Recognizing that change is not inherent in every one of your contexts, but oftentimes you're having to move from here to there in a day-to-day way, and it's important to know what are the disciplines that you can use as you might challenge even ordinary, not conflictual kinds of processes in an organization or congregation. But challenging the process means also challenging ourselves. Challenging something in ourselves in terms of our own tendency towards reactivity, challenging ourselves in terms of those not so constructive conflict dealing or negotiating kinds of behaviors, and to also recognize that we might have to, as Heifetz says, lead on the line, be willing to go to that risky place in our leadership. And oftentimes when we're playing it safe, we're also not helping the congregation or the organization move to their next level of development as well. So let's ground this discussion in a why that for me is about vocation and calling. Really, as we're working with any organization, either as a chaplain or another role, or a minister in a congregation or middle judicatory role, really what we're trying to do is call people towards where they can feel called in a sense of vocation to what it is that they're doing. Oftentimes we can lock into routine and get into a rut. We can lock into the familiar and forget that we're called to something beyond just the familiar. We're also called to bring forth possibilities within the arenas in which we minister. So I love this quote by Frederick Buechner. I'm sure many of you have heard it before, that vocation is the place that God calls you to. It's the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. So even though we like to shape our organizations or our congregations to something new, we can't do that to the exclusion of also honoring what is and recognizing the joy that might be present in what is as well, and also the gifts that they have to offer to the world or to this next challenge that they're facing. So I want to offer that this might be like a template over some of the work that we've been doing on Heifetz, just a relanguaging of it that might, in a sense, bring it to more ordinary language, more religious language for some of us. But I do think there is a discipline in describing what is. So in HIFIS, that's the observation, the observing, and the noticing. And really being able to describe fully what is. This is an area that I think each of you, each of us as leaders can always keep honing. We love to move to that interpretive realm because we do that on the day-to-day basis. But if our interpretation is not grounded in deep description, then we're going to find that it's hard to get buy-in and ownership for change. And as leaders, we have to be just as good at describing as we are at interpreting. So describing is one of the practices, and I'll go through each of these in a more detailed way. So let me just outline them first. I like having 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 5. That's right, 5 Ds. I got them both up there. Describe, dialogue, discern, discover through action, and decide. So describing really is using your observing skills to talk about what's happening in the community and the world around the organization and the religious world, describing what's happening in the world around the organization or the congregation. And many of you have touched on some of these pieces in your papers and in your final paper, that usually the impetus for change might come from outside of the organization or the congregation and not necessarily from within the congregation. Also, however, it's important for us to describe in a non-judgmental but observing and disciplined way what it is that we're observing and noticing in the congregation or the organization itself. So these are disciplines for me. They're spiritual disciplines that require just as much skill and effort as our tendency towards rushing towards interpretation do. And then to engage people in dialogue. Now, I have just put up some sample questions here. You're going to come up with your own kinds of questions, but as you're trying to engage people after a full, deeper discussion, description of what is, that leads into the so what. How do we make sense of it? And to do it in a spirit of dialogue, where we're not prematurely moving ahead to the solution or what we want them to do, I think is so essential. And so just recognize if you have a tendency to move from description to prescription really quickly. So to engage people so that they can do the adaptive work both internally and interpersonally that are going to allow the change to happen. So here are some sample kinds of questions. What do you feel are most important characteristics and spiritual gifts for our congregation or our organization to celebrate and to offer in this time and this place that we've described, hopefully clearly and in a captivating way? And another question would be, what do you feel called to or summoned to respond to in our organization and community as you look outside the window? What is it that calls you? What is it that summons you? As you look at the changes around the congregation and the organization, and or even within the organization or congregation, what calls you to do something? What summons you to make some shifts or changes? And to do things in a spirit of dialogue means we create an atmosphere where people advocate for their own position, but they're also willing to be influenced by that of others. Some of us are very good at advocating for our own position, our own experience. We're less good at being influenced or impacted by what we learned or hear from others. And others of us are much more influenced and impacted by others and less apt to move forward with describing our own proposition or proposal for a change. So dialogue is the delicate balance or dance between the two. And so each of you should know, where do you need to put more of your growth and more of your energy? Is it in the deeper listening? So rather than coming forth too quickly with your own proposal, or is it stepping forward with your own proposal and your own advocating for things? So in reading your papers, I sense that there's a mixture of both of those kinds of tendencies in our colleague group here. From dialogue, then move to discernment, which is a deeper kind of listening. It's not the interpersonal listening so much that happens in dialogue, but it's the discerning in which we're listening also to the whispers of God. We're listening to the Spirit. We're listening to what it is that wants to emerge in this situation. If we understand that the creation is an ongoing co-creation, that the gospel calls us to a continual process of liberating, justice-making, bringing forth possibility and potential in the full reign of God, then we need to be able to discern, given what it is that is, given our dialogue around it, what are people feeling called to do, called by God to embody these marks, to be such a community? What do you feel are the primary ways that your congregation or organization is being called by God to embody whatever it is that you responded to in terms of questions 1 and 2? And then I think another tendency I notice is that people want to move towards, okay, I've discerned this, now let me enact it. And I want to, in a true Haifa spirit, but also in a religious kind of process, have us understand that from discernment we can move to that place of discovering through enacting and embodying. If we understand that part of our religious vocation is incarnating, it doesn't mean that incarnation happens in an instant. Just think about the narratives about Jesus and understand that that incarnation of his Godfulness came over time and was discovered and enacted and embodied over time, so that people could come to understand that which was of God in him and how God was working through him. Consequently, I think it's also important for us to think about this experimental period once we've discerned a direction, and to discover through action. Think about whatever directions might come from a dialogue and a discernment process, and say, why is this direction important? Why do we feel called? What are our current strengths and activities in this area? What we might need to overcome in order to move in this direction? What are some possible experiments and actions, some prototypes, some specific actions that we can take to move in this direction? And what gifts do each person on a team, a leadership team, minister, or staff have personally to offer to enact or embody this direction? So I'm posing this phase of the process as that kind of prototyping phase, that experimenting through action that Haifas also talks about, and recognize that this is an intentional learning period. It's a parallel learning process where you're engaging in the new actions in such a way that you're willing to learn from it. And then after that experimental period, then you can begin to make some decisions. Okay, given what it is that we've learned, are we wanting to decide to move in this direction? And if so, what are the implications for our staff time, for our volunteer ministries? What are the implications for our resource allocation, etc.? All the various things. What are our timelines for beginning to enact this, and so forth? You know, we all have different governing structures and decision-making processes in the congregations and organizations that we work in, and I recognize that. But I think it's important for you as a leader to at least have some framework in which you begin to understand that part of acting as a leader is engaging in these disciplines of describing, creating opportunities for dialogue and for discernment, then discovering through action, experimental prototyping kind of period, and then moving towards deciding. So hopefully you can begin to understand that part of your role as a leader is to help guide the process, to challenge the processes that might want to move prematurely through deciding without dialogue and discernment, or deciding without an experimental period of deep learning and engagement, or that might want to move through any of this quick decisions without really describing what is, and beginning to feel that sense of vocation, your deep joy, and the world's deep need as you move forward. So I wanted to offer this as just a kind of a perspective for many of you as you begin to think about your adaptive challenges. And so this is just a review, really, of the HIFIS work. You can see that getting on the balcony is that part of just really being able to describe in a systemic kind of way what's going on. So the Steinke work that we'll be diving into this week is also a way of getting on the balcony, stepping out of the dance. The dance floor really is that place where we engage and react and respond to what it is that we see, but hopefully from a more reflective place because of the discipline of getting on the balcony. The practice field is what I'm talking about in terms of that discovering through action, to set some specific kinds of experiments. So for many of you, I found that in your papers, that practice field place will be one that you want to think about. How do you do something where you're also saying, okay, we're doing something intentionally to learn together what works or doesn't work about this so that we can then move forward to the next place of decision. Okay. So now, oops, I'm moving a little fast there. So now I want to talk about the piece of this video around recognizing our own self and studying ourself, which is a big part of what Steinke is offering us this week. But I don't want to do this at the exclusion of this also really clearly studying the organizational and system dynamics as well. It's a both and. So even though I'm taking this route to kind of having us look at ourselves for a moment, it's both and that's another pattern I noticed, that sometimes some of you are very good and skilled at talking about and recognizing your own self and the role that you're playing in the shifts that you're needing to make. That's great. That's wonderful, and that's an essential part of this integral approach to leadership development that I'm hoping to guide us through this semester. Alongside of that, and just as important, is understanding the dynamics of the organization, the organizational system as well. HIFIS has provided a lot of tools for us to begin to do a systematic analysis and diagnosis of what is happening in the organization around the adaptive change, who the various stakeholders are, and also at helping us look at our own self as a system. So I want to highlight the self as system piece here by drawing on some significant research that has been done by people who've worked on what's called the Leadership Circle, which is a tool that I often use in my coaching and consulting practices as well. So whenever there's an event, we're always making meaning. Whenever there's an event, it's never just an event. An event oftentimes triggers some kind of response in us. If the event and the response are seen as the only dynamic, then we're missing a critical piece, because in addition to the event and the response is the emotion or the behavior that is part of that response. So it's never a response just in terms of behavior, never a response just in terms of emotion. It's important for us to recognize both dimensions in ourselves. Some of us have more of a vocabulary for emotion. Some of us have more of a vocabulary for behavior. And as we develop ourselves as leaders, it's important to develop vocabulary in both of those arenas. And the response usually leads to some kind of result. So this oftentimes is how we look at things. There's an event, a response that is an emotion or behavior, and that leads to the result that we're aiming. However, this is just one way of understanding things, and this doesn't include an important piece that I think is also essential for us to understand. You have the luxury as students right now, as Doctor of Ministry students, to also look at your own operating system, your own self, your own person, your own meaning-making system, to recognize that it's never really as clear-cut as the first diagram indicated, that when there's an event, it always goes through our own operating system, and I'm going to talk about a few of those in just a moment. That operating system leads to our interpretation, which then leads to our response, which then can evoke certain kinds of emotions and behaviors. So, oops, I went too quickly there. So it's the operating system that's important, and two distinctions I want to make are the reactive operating system, which Steinke allows us to understand a little bit this week, and the more creative operating system. And what Steinke does, drawing from Murray Bowen's work on family systems and emotional systems therapy, is to help us understand that the reactive response is almost biological. It almost feels like automatic. And it can feel very automatic in some systems. Someone scratches and we're all itching, you know? Or vice versa. Someone's itching and we're all scratching. But in any case, it's important for us to be a self-differentiated leader and to recognize that, again, the observer that we are is such an important dimension of leading. If we don't have a clear observer, then we can really get into reactive responses. And so one way of cultivating that observer is to get to the balcony. Another way to develop that observer is to take time for prayer, reflection, and meditation. Another way to develop that observer is to talk to colleagues before responding, so that you can begin to hear yourself into speech, as the feminist theologian Nellie Norton says. And provide those opportunities for one another. So the interpretive piece, how we make sense of the event, oftentimes comes from our own operating system and leads to our response. So let's look at two structures of mind. Again, this comes from the Leadership Circle material. This isn't material that I've given to you because I feel like I could overload you with too many things, but I kind of picked out some things I thought were important to this. So one structure is the problem reacting structure. Most of us can recognize when this is happening for us. And another is the outcome creating structure. Okay, one tends towards anxiety containing, the other tends towards energy unleashing. So let's look at each of these. So in the problem reacting, usually we see the problem as a threat, which can emerge for us as fear. Whenever threat's possible, we can get to a place of fear. Fear because of uncertainty, fear because of anticipating what could happen, fear coming from our own biography as well. This threat might seem very familiar, building on that word family, familiar to us. Fear can lead to a reactive stance, and that can then exacerbate this kind of cycle of seeing the problem as a threat. So we want to be able to recognize that we want to get out of that kind of process and minimize some of the sense of problem as threat, minimize some of the fear or the reaction, and so forth. And so, over time, we might see ourselves in a kind of a reactive place, where we feel anxiety, we contain the anxiety, we feel anxiety kick in, we contain it, and we're going into a kind of reactive roller coaster kind of process within ourselves. Then there is this other frame in which we are clear about our own purpose and vision. So Steinke talks about this as well, as that self-differentiated leader and the importance of having a sense of purpose and vision. I don't think these come necessarily just from the leader herself, but also coming from deep listening of people in the congregation or organization as well. Our purpose and vision can tap into our sense of passion, what we feel called towards to do and to become, and that can guide our action and reinforce our sense of purpose, vision, passion, and action in such a way that it becomes a positive kind of reinforcing sort of process. And so energy gets unleashed rather than feeling, and it grows and develops rather than feeling like we're in a reactive kind of place. So if more of you are interested in this particular model, from the Leadership Circle, I can share some things with you. I just want to reiterate something that I did during our intensive week, and just making the distinction between the creative and the reactive. That we have creative competencies and we have reactive styles. And that we're always managing people and task and finding how much orientation should we give to relationship, how much orientation should we give to the task. And sometimes we might be overemphasizing people at the detriment of getting anything done, or sometimes we might be overemphasizing tasks, getting something done, and not taking into account the people that we're actually working with. So we want to be as much as possible creative in our relationship responses, and also creative in our task creative responses, so that we're actually able to get things done and do much of the things that are on the top of this particular circle. We can't do that oftentimes without encountering some of our own reactive tendencies. And I think Steinke's work allows us to recognize some of the ways in which our reactivity inhibits our capacity to be creative. So, So the creative competencies are listed here. I'm not going to you're not going to be able to see them here, so let me go to outlining them here. So they are relating, self-awareness, authenticity, systems awareness, and achieving. You'll get these slides as a handout so you can study these more carefully later. And again, if you're interested, send me an email and I'll send you more of an article on this. But to just kind of recognize that these creative competencies are what enable us to lead in ways that both allow us to be creative in our people competencies as well as our task competencies. It's a both and. Sometimes we sacrifice one on the sake of the other. And what this particular leadership model helps us understand is that both are important. So the reactive styles include complying, protecting, and controlling. With each of these kinds of behaviors that are listed here. So I'll just highlight a few. I think I did some of this in the intensive week. So the complying can oftentimes lead to our trying to please others or being passive in our leadership, which impacts our capacity to be creative and take risks when risks are needed to be taken. Protecting can make us look distant or to distance ourselves. And we also can be protecting in our critique and our own arrogance. Can you imagine that? In such a way that it doesn't build the relationship capacities or allow us to be creative in how we approach the task. When we're controlling, autocratic, we're driven by our own sense of ambition or our own drivenness or a sense of perfection, then that also impacts our capacity to take risks, to be authentic, to have a sense of self-awareness, but most important, to have a system awareness that allows us to recognize what's needed in the system in order to bring about change. So I give you all of these as kind of a background for recognizing that the process of leadership involves being able to both, as Heifetz and Steinke point out, be able to diagnose and see the system, to recognize the various ways that we can interpret what are going on and to hone our interpretive lenses, and also to be able to be creative in our interventions and our responses. And it also, alongside of that, leadership requires us to have that self-awareness that allows us to recognize that we have to cultivate the observer, to forestall our reactive tendencies in such a way that we might not be able to lead because we're coming from a place of anxiety. The anxiety might be in the system. We catch that anxiety, and therefore there isn't, as Steinke might talk about it, a biological head that can kind of lead, as well as I like to think of it as head and heart that can lead a congregation or organization forward. So now let's move into talking about conflict and some conflict dynamics. And this comes from my work working with the conflict dynamics profile. So conflict really is any situation in which people have apparently incompatible goals, interests, principles, or feelings. So think about your own life experience, your own ministry experience, and recognize that in many ways it's inevitable. That conflict is going to happen because people have different biologies, different biographies, different perspectives and experiences, different communities of origin, different identities, all numbers of things. And so we have to recognize that conflict is always going to happen, not at a high level all the time, but at some level conflict will happen. And so how we respond to those differences is what's important. And if we get to a reactive place, we might contribute more to the conflict than its creative resolution and utilization. So, in this, I'm going to kind of go ahead here to talk about the path of conflict from this perspective. Usually there's a precipitating event. It could be a hot button. For example, if you hate being micromanaged and you have a session or a board that are trying to micromanage you, you get into a kind of a hot button and you get overreactive in some way. That can initiate conflict. Conflict can then go to constructive responses or destructive responses. The constructive ones are behaviors which keep the conflict, and I'd like to say the temperature of the conflict, to a minimum or an even balance in such a way. Destructive responses escalate or prolong the conflict unnecessarily. And you know from your reading with Heifetz that sometimes we have to turn up the heat just a little bit. But if we turn it up too quickly, people get into their reactive place, and it can be precipitate destructive responses rather than creative ones. We're going to look at conflict also as trying to stay on the task of solving the problem or the difference and resolving it, so that tension can be decreased and people can feel like they're functioning together in a constructive way. The person-focused conflict oftentimes can focus on the personal as opposed to the situational or the problem. It can elicit negative emotions that oftentimes heat up the conflict, get personalized, the tension increase, and then the group is really not functioning. It might be decreasing in its own functioning. So one de-escalates conflict and the other escalates conflict. So we want to look at constructive and destructive, or what I like to call not so constructive responses. So typical outcomes of constructive responses are that there are win-win solutions that can come forward, that open and honest communication of feelings can occur, that both parties' needs are met, that there are non-judgmental actions that occur, but not sticking adamantly to one's position. One can loosen up or hold lightly one's position, that one can actively resolve the conflict, not allowing the conflict to continue, and thinking of thoughtful responses, not impulsive ones. And a ministry team or a lay ministry team or leadership within a congregation can improve their own performance, their own capacity to acknowledge difference, to learn from difference, and to utilize that difference moving forward. So as leaders, we have to be very conflict competent in order to be able to lead a congregation or an organization through change. So the moment we are attempting to move through change, we have to recognize that we're going to encounter some kind of difference, some kind of conflict. And we're triggered to think that conflict is always bad, but it's how we respond to conflict that's so important. So, the typical outcomes of destructive responses are there are feelings of anger and frustration. There can be judgmental actions that can occur. There is a sense of getting even and keeping score. The other party does not have its needs met, so it can kind of go underground or splinter off or cause havoc down the road. There are closed channels of communication. There's a kind of refusing to deal with issues, to work through them. A kind of standoffishness or a stymied or stuck kind of place. There's a decreased self-confidence in the congregation or in the relationships. Tasks are not completed, and the performance of the leadership team also decreases. So I want to put these constructive and not so constructive or so-called destructive responses together in a model and talk with you about those. So as I go through this might be a good time for you to kind of do your own self-assessment for yourself. I'm going to start over on the right side, the destructive side, what I call the not so constructive, and start at the top, so the upper right-hand quadrant that begins with winning at all cost. Notice there's an opportunity in both the constructive or the not so constructive to be active or passive in one's response. So the destructive ones, and you might think about a particular situation where conflict or difference was present, or just what your tendencies might be, and not in a sense of self-judgment, but more in a sense of self-learning and self-assessment. So in the destructive active, there's the tendency to want to win at all cost. And then I'm going to go over to the left side, rather than taking the perspective of others. There's a displaying of anger in an active way, rather than creating solutions together. There's the demeaning of others, rather than expressing emotions. Expressing emotions is different than demeaning or acting out those emotions. Expressing emotions are simply being able to say, I'm feeling overwhelmed right now. I'm confused. I'm not certain that this is a good time to have this conversation. I'm feeling upset. I need to take a little time away to figure out, when's the best time to continue this conversation. Whatever it is, expressing is very important, but not in a way that demeans others. And then retaliating is different than reaching out, proactively reaching out to someone and saying, for example, I noticed in our session meeting you didn't say anything the other night, but I felt like you had some things to say. Is that something you'd like to share with me now, or would you like to talk about why it was difficult for you to share then? Or maybe I just misinterpreted it, but kind of proactively reaching out to someone rather than letting that person feel isolated from the group as well. On the bottom of the destructive right-hand side, you see the passive behaviors. These are all behaviors, by the way, so the fact that they're behaviors is that we can choose to do something else. So a passive destructive one that I've often noticed in a lot of clergy that I do coaching with is avoiding. hoping that by avoiding it will go away, hoping that by avoiding that somehow or another that temporary feeling of relief because you're not dealing with it will be longer lasting. But we know the more we avoid, the more we're not building the capacity to constructively deal with things. Yielding oftentimes can be like, okay, what doesn't matter, there's nothing possible here, I'll just go along to get along. Now notice that in any of these passive behaviors like avoiding or yielding, we're not talking about the occasional yielding or the occasional avoiding. We're talking about when the gear gets stuck in that behavior, and that becomes something where you're not as resilient or creative in your responses because it becomes more of a pattern. Hiding one's emotions. Oftentimes with clergy, I feel like the hiding of emotions leads to a kind of a resentment over time that siphons off some of the joy in their ministry. And then the self-criticizing that can also occur. We're saying, oh, I can't do anything here. I don't have the gifts. I don't want to do this because maybe it's not mine to do. Over time, one can be second-guessing oneself so much that it leads to inactivity and a not-so-constructive response to difference. So rather than avoiding, we want to be able to do, in our taking time away, to do reflective thinking. And that's kind of like going to the balcony to reflect on the situation. I'm being persistent. Some of you may feel that I'm being relentless in having you do these reflective papers because I see those as balcony creating activities for your own leadership. It's a practice that oftentimes we don't do unless we're in a class or whatever. So I hope that you're honing your capacities to do deeper reflective thinking yourself. Deeper analysis in that reflective. The delay responding is better than yielding or hiding one's emotions. It's kind of taking a step back and saying, can I get back to you about that? Or let's not try to decide in this meeting what it is we're going to do. Let's just hear each other out. And then the next time we gather, then let's have some time to think about it and then see where our decisions might lead, where we might be led to a decision. And adapting means being willing to recognize you're wrong, to be willing to learn from a situation, to be willing to acknowledge that in a constructive way. So you're adapting your own behavior in a way that learns from the situation itself. So these are all behaviors that I want to point out, and you can kind of think about this when you get the handout. What are your strengths? What are the constructive behaviors that you engage in continually? And what are those destructive or what I like to call not so constructive behaviors? And which of those that are more of a tendency for you, more of a habit in the not so constructive that you might want to shift? And the way to shift would be to look at shifting to the behaviors on the left-hand column. So I'm going to stop here for now. There will be another video on immunity to change, but I wanted to give you these kind of frameworks as we begin to look at conflict and difference, look at system dynamics, and look at ourselves operating within a system. Okay.